Welcome, everyone. It's very nice to see you and to welcome you to this conversation. As some of you may know, my name is Cathy Ashton and I'm chairing here the Global Europe programme for the Woodrow Wilson Centre. And in doing that, what we're looking at is are the issues that really affect the shape, the politics, the way that Europe as a continent grows, develops, changes. So everything from the transatlantic relationship to what happens in trade and investment to, of course, the situation in Ukraine and the relationships with Russia or with China. And inevitably, a big focus will be on what we in Europe call the southern neighbourhood. The countries that border to the south, which have long historical ties and which are incredibly important economically and I would argue politically to European nations. I'm delighted that joining me today for this conversation is my friend and colleague, Nasser Judeh. Nasser has done many things, but particularly I focus upon his role as the Foreign Minister of Jordan. And I've often said to people, the place that I went most and the person I consulted most was Jordan and Nasser. The reason for that is the combination of the way that Jordan has worked consistently with Europe, with the US, with others, to both explain and support the position of the region, but also to be a problem solver within the region. And so it's a particular pleasure that we're able to have this conversation today. And I'm going to begin with a few questions to Nasser, and then we'll open it up to you for either comment or question. If it's comment, much as we're interested, please keep it succinct so that we get to hear more of him. And if it's question, make sure we can answer it. It's usually my plea, or at least attempt to answer it. But this should be a relaxed occasion. And Nasser, it's great to be here. Jordan is a very special country to me, as you well know. And the work that you and His Majesty have done is well recognised by leaders past and present. But Jordan has had its fair share of challenges in recent times: refugees, economic situation, water. So it would be really interesting, I think, to begin with, what do you see from the perspective of your country are the biggest challenge facing it now?
Thank you very much, Lady Ashton, Cathy, my dear friend. I too am honored to have known you for many years, to have worked very, very closely with you. During your tenure as High Representative Vice President in the context of the European Union, but also in working with you in different contexts today. So thank you for the kind words you mentioned about Jordan, about His Majesty, about my humble self. It's always good to know that you're around because you're a voice of reason and wisdom. As HRVP, you were tasked with the almost impossible mission of getting 27 and 28 countries together on board with certain policies and certain approaches, and you had your plate full. So we were actually extremely fortunate that you were paying a lot of attention to our region, to the Middle East peace process, to countries like Jordan that were and still are carrying a huge burden of not just refugees and the humanitarian spillover of the conflict in Syria, but also the repercussions of many conflicts and sources of instability and factors of instability over many, many years. So you mentioned Jordan. I will come to the challenges and I'll come to the problems that we're facing. But let me start by saying that Jordan occupies a strategic position in the Middle East, geostrategically, but also with a global outreach. Not many people know that in a year and a half we will be celebrating the 100th anniversary of contemporary modern Jordan. By the way, I always remind people, and sometimes they are surprised, that we are one of the oldest continuing political systems, not just in the region, but the entire world. If you look at all the changes that took place, the tectonic changes that took place after the Second World War, all the changes in Europe, all the changes in South America, all the changes in the Far East, all the changes in Africa. I mean, apart from the few obvious countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Jordan is one of the longest surviving political systems, the same exact political system since 1921. Jordan also, and I'm not being subjective, I'm trying to be as objective as possible by stating facts, talks to everybody, has open channels of communication with everyone. Jordan believes in the stability of the region. Jordan has earned the credentials by being at the receiving end of wave after wave of refugees, by being in a region where conflict in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s of the last century was a daily occurrence, where there was a coup d'etat after a coup d'etat, with revolution after revolution, war after war. And we've always maintained our sense of reason and sense of commitment and dedication to having a stable Middle East. And I don't even need to, because I'm speaking to an informed audience, I don't need to remind people of the efforts of the late King Hussein and His Majesty King Abdullah II in peacemaking, in bringing people together. Not just in the context of the obvious elephant in the room, which is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and the wider Arab-Israeli conflict, but also in having peace in the region. This doesn't come without a cost. And you asked me about the major challenges that we're facing today. Economic challenges. Jordan, you mentioned water and you mentioned refugees. These are just but two factors. We are one of the poorest countries in the world in terms of water resources. I think we're sometimes number one or number two. We import 97% of our energy. And therefore we're totally reliant on imported energy, and we're totally reliant on the few drops of rainwater that we get every year, and that's one of our biggest challenges. So the economic challenge is really what keeps His Majesty the King and his government and the people of Jordan awake at night. And yes, we've had in the last 10 years or so, in the context of what is referred to as Arab Spring and the humanitarian spillover of the conflict in Syria in particular, we've had to deal with the influx of about almost 1.4 million Syrians who crossed our borders to find a safe haven. And of course, we shared with them what little we have. And that's Jordan's policy. But like I said, it doesn't come without a cost. I mentioned yesterday in a private conversation, I'll repeat it in a public conversation, and that is that Jordan does its fair share in the context of the international community. But I think the international community has to do its fair share in supporting countries like Jordan, small countries that happen to be geographically contiguous to a conflict zone, and that are shouldering the responsibility on behalf of the rest of the international community. So I know we've had initiatives from the European Union, we've had initiatives from the UK, the London Conference, for example. We've had several initiatives, and we've had several bilateral efforts to assist Jordan, but it's way short of what is required. I keep reminding people again, when you're talking about 1.35 million Syrians in Jordan today, that's 20% of the population. And that increase came over a span of 18 months, believe it or not. Between 2013, 2015, we had 1.5 million. That's 20%. Imagine having a 20% increase in your population in a span of 18 months. Imagine in UK numbers, if you have 12 or 13 million people arriving at your shores in 18 months. In US terms, imagine if you have 65 or 66 million people suddenly showing up over about 18 months. So this is, it's simple arithmetic, but it just reminds people that we have to stand together, shoulder to shoulder, to face these challenges. My very quick answer to what Cathy said is the economic challenges. Unemployment is high. Jordan has a very highly educated population. We are a country of 7 million people with over 30 universities. Do the math, as they say here. So we're highly educated, we're highly aware, very, very entrepreneurial. Jordan, under His Majesty King Abdullah II, over the last 20 years, has become a hub for a lot of businesses, for a lot of information communication technology. initiatives. We are, I think, one of the largest, if not the largest, Arabic content provider in the internet. And that's, that just shows you. I mean, if you look at the young of Jordan, and 70% of the population of Jordan are young, they're extremely forward-looking, extremely innovative, but they want opportunities. And these opportunities are no longer just local or regional, they are global. And we're trying to be part of that network. So it's very, very important that you look at Jordan in that context. A modern, forward-looking country, a highly educated society, very young, looking for opportunities, facing serious economic challenges, trying to be a voice of reason in a volatile region, and in a lot of cases succeeding.
So really good analysis, I think, and this question of young population, which across the region, young, often highly educated. You see the challenge manifests itself in many different ways. We saw that in what we call the Arab Spring. Young people taking to the streets, being unprepared to put up with what might have begun as initially an economic question and quickly translated into a political question. You mentioned early on, though, the one that the kind of the political challenge that sits at the heart of the region, which is, of course, the Middle East peace process, or lack of Middle East peace process. And we are at the point when Israel is trying to put together a new government with their system. That's a very complicated and complex thing to have to do. And for Jordan, two things. One, you have played, as always, an incredibly valuable and important role, both in terms of the work you have done to try and support resolution, but also in supporting others, not least the United States, in their efforts, as well as, of course, the European Union. So where are we now? What do you think the options are looking like? And do you have any comments on what might happen now in Israel and what that might mean?
Sure. Just a quick comment on the last topic also. In the context of Arab Spring, you're absolutely right. In many countries it began as an economic thing and quickly transformed itself into something political. But it was at the beginning a cry by people who were disenchanted economically and who were looking for opportunities and who felt that they have absolutely no say in the shaping and running of their government or their future. The difference in Jordan, of course, was that we completely averted that. I mean, the winds of change were a gentle breeze in Jordan, simply because we have a political and economic reform agenda that is spearheaded from the top. It's not a reaction to something from the bottom. It's literally the king and His Majesty's initiatives through the governments to basically implement a program of political and economic reform that sometimes, because of regional events, one supersedes the other, and you take two steps forward and maybe half a step back for forces and reasons and factors completely out of your control. But the reason why Jordan, because if you remember back in 2011, everybody was saying, who's next and who's after and who. Well, Jordan, of course, we were always confident that we didn't have the negative elements that you saw in different countries. You have a highly educated population, but you have opportunities as well. But the market is very, very small, and I think that the economy and the economic challenges were of concern to us and are of concern to us still. But with the refugees, we had another problem, because don't forget that the refugees that came from Syria, very similar culture, very similar background, very similar skills, and it was probably a bit too close to home this time, because they were competing for the same jobs that Jordanians would go for. So it caused a bit of an imbalance in the situation, and we still face major economic challenges. Now, going to the peace process, let me also remind that, or what's left of the peace process, I should say. Let me also remind that peace between Israelis and Palestinians, peace between the Arabs and Israel, security and stability for the entire region is an existential thing for Jordan. It's not Jordan is not an honest broker. Jordan is not a mediator. Jordan is a stakeholder, and I'll tell you why. Number one, speaking of refugees, Jordan is the largest host of Palestinian refugees in the world. We have 42% of all the Palestinian refugees from 1948, 1967, etc., etc. Number two, all the final status issues, and you're all familiar with final status issues, all the final status issues that were being negotiated and are frozen now and should be negotiated still between the Palestinians and Israelis. Jordan has a serious stake in all of them. What are the final status issues? Refugees, Jerusalem, water, security, and borders. And when I say borders, I include settlements. I mean, it's a foregone conclusion. So all five areas are an existential thing for Jordan. Refugees, again, we're the largest host of Palestinian refugees. And we believe in the General Assembly resolution that calls for return, the right of return, and compensation, not or. And when it comes to Jerusalem, as you know, His Majesty the King is the custodian of Muslim and Christian holy places in Jerusalem. Something that he takes extremely seriously, and that's why Jordan's at the forefront. And should not be alone, by the way. Jordan is always calling for people to rally together to stop incursions into the holy sites or changing the historic status quo of the Haram al-Sharif and the entire compound there. So that's the holy sites. When it comes to water, I don't think it's just a Jordan, Palestine, Israel thing. It's not a bilateral, trilateral thing. It's a multilateral thing. I mean, this is, you don't have borders when it comes to water. Israel, perhaps, is fortunate because it's on the Mediterranean. It has all these desalination plants, and I don't think it has as much of a problem with water shortages than we do. But for Jordan, it is an existential thing. For Palestine, it's an existential thing. When it comes to security and borders, again, Jordan has the longest border with Israel and the longest border with the would-be Palestinian state. So you can't have a discussion between Israel and Palestine on borders without having Jordan say its say or contributing to that discussion. And that includes security along the Jordan Valley and beyond that. Of course, down from the Dead Sea to all the way through Wadi Araba to the Gulf of Aqaba, which is covered under the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty. So recently, this issue has been in the foreground when Prime Minister Netanyahu, in his election campaign, said that if elected and if able to form a coalition government, he will annex the Jordan Valley and the northern part of the Dead Sea, which would mean pretty much the end of the two-state solution. And if you have an end to the two-state solution, I mean, if you have literally a division of the West Bank longitudinally, and in some cases, some very, very hardline Israeli politicians talk about annexing the settlement blocks. So you have a latitudinal division of the West Bank. This is the end of the Palestinian state as we would like to see it. This is the end of the two-state solution. If you know, the cliche that we always repeat is a viable, independent, territorially contiguous Palestinian state with a safe and secure Israel and security and safety and stability for the entire region. So that territorial contiguity is completely destroyed by the notion of annexing the Jordan Valley and the northern part of the Dead Sea or annexing the settlement blocks. Having said all that, where are we now? We are very much with the Israeli elections and the results of the Israeli elections. Who's going to form the government? Is it going to be a national unity government? Is the fact that extremely hardline parties will join this coalition going to affect the general orientation of the approach to peace in the next phase or not? We have yet to see. The second component, of course, is the much anticipated deal of the century, and we've been waiting for that for 2.5 years. We've seen the economic part of the deal of the century and that workshop that was held in the Gulf recently. But we also had statements and actions that don't really encourage us to think too positively of what's going to come in that deal of the century. Having said that, I still maintain that I have to see it before I pass judgment on it. We have to see if that deal of the century will allow for a resumption of direct negotiations or at least creating the environment for the resumption of direct negotiations on all issues between Palestinians and Israelis. Yeah, nobody's saying that this administration has to go back to previous initiatives or traction that was achieved on the ground before or whatever. Every administration has its own approach to Middle East peacemaking. But you have to have at least certain parameters that are not far off from what we've been discussing before and were never able to achieve. The problem with all the Middle East peace initiatives, whether they were US initiatives, European initiatives, local initiatives, regional initiatives, is that they never crossed the finish line. There have been initiatives that made tremendous success. There were initiatives that were stillborn. There were initiatives that achieved a little success. But we were never able to cross the finish line. I think the time has come to have an initiative, regardless what it's called, where direct negotiations result in the creation of a Palestinian state that is independent and viable, and security and stability for the entire region and all the countries and peoples of the region. Short of that, you're going to end up with the one-state reality. Some people call it the one-state solution. It's not a solution, because it will be to the detriment of Israel and its security, and certainly to the detriment of the Palestinians and their hopes and aspirations for dignity and independence and sovereignty. So.
Whenever you and I would visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu, I was very conscious that for him, the issue he would try to turn to and move away from discussing the Middle East peace process was, of course, Iran, and the deep concern that many in Israel held about the viewpoint and intentions of this nation. And these concerns were shared by many in the region who have been long worried about what Iran is seeking to do. All of you know that I spent 4 years negotiating the Iranian deal, so I have a knowledge but also a particular perspective on it. But as tensions rise in the region, and as one sees the thinking almost manifesting itself in terms of how to now try and address these issues, from your perspective, from looking at it from home, how do you see the tensions playing out? Where do you think perhaps the solutions might come from? How do you see the region being able to play the role that it's long said, and rightly, it needs to play in trying to find a way through with Iran?
I'll answer this in two ways, if I may.
Whatever you like.
Kathy. First of all, Iran and the recent escalation and the tensions, but also Iran in the context of the peace process. Where we differ with successive Israeli politicians and governments is that there's always that boogeyman theory that we have to concentrate on that threat at the expense of making peace with the Palestinians, at the expense of the region's stability and security in the context of the peace process. Our approach is always, well, it is peace that will bring about security, and then we're all able to look at regional threats together if we happen to agree on that. So what I would like to put is you can't escape the reality that it is through peace that Israel will get its future security. By the way, this is the consensus of almost all former Israeli retired military officials, serving military officials, intelligence and security officials. I mean, they all think that the future security of the state of Israel lies in the two-state solution, in having peace. I was at a conference once in Central Asia, and I sat with an Israeli politician who was a prominent member of the cabinet at the time, at his request. And I was, of course, in my introductory monologue talking about peace and the importance of arriving at a peace with dignity for the Palestinians, sovereign Palestinian state, independent Palestinian state, security for the entire region. And his response was, I think we're going a bit too fast on this issue, and maybe we need to slow down. And I said, slower than 100 years? I mean, and this person was convinced that no, you need 2 or 3 generations of preparation, psychological and educational, I don't know, before we start, peace negotiation, because this is a generational thing. And of course, I think this is, as they say in England, codswallop, but as I would like to say, complete nonsense. I think generations have had enough of conflict and war and insecurity and lack of stability, and I think they want a way out. But if we take our time and slow down, as this gentleman suggested, I think we may see that the young, who are the majority, will start giving up, and they will develop this brick wall mentality that that's it, we have nothing to lose anymore, we've tried everything, and therefore lean towards extremism and total frustration, whether it's economic or political or what. So when it comes to Iran and what's happening recently, I think nobody wants an escalation. Nobody wants an outbreak of hostilities. Nobody wants to see the region, whether the immediate region or the expanded region, fall into the abyss again with military conflict and instability. I mean, we all know that at the end of the day, there are certain norms that every country has to abide by. There has to be respect for regional stability. There has to be respect for the independence and sovereignty of countries. I can't speak about this with Cathy here. I mean, she negotiated or helped negotiate working with many countries a deal with Iran, and I think maybe we should benefit from listening to you on where we are today. But I have to say that that I see a scenario where wills are being tested, and that in that kind of situation, a very small thing that goes wrong can result in a serious outbreak of military hostilities and instability for the entire region. Let's not forget that this is a region that is geostrategically extremely important for the rest of the world. So I think we're watching and hopefully not bracing ourselves, but like I said, when wills are being tested, anything can go wrong, and this is not good. But maybe I'll revert it back to you.
If somebody asks me a question, I'll answer it. We've got about half an hour, and so I wondered if you would like to join in with questions or comments. There's loads of things we haven't touched on. I just wanted to just start up the ball rolling, but we haven't talked about Syria, we haven't talked about other issues or countries in the region. Or equally, you may want to focus on some of the big issues that I think we've already picked up on. So if you'd like to ask anything, there are microphones on either side. Put your hand up, wait for the microphone, and then if you wouldn't mind telling us who you are, because we don't recognise everyone.
Good morning. My name is Fadi Samara. Maybe this question is to both of you. This session is about EU-Mideast relations, so I'd like to ask you, what is the EU-Mideast strategy?
After you.
Well, it isn't about that, but nice of you to think that that's important. And I think the question is very interesting. I'm not responsible for the European Union strategy anymore. But I say that only because it will have evolved and grown and developed in ways that I think are relevant to the issues that it faces. Fundamentally, as I said at the beginning, the way that Europe operates is in part governed by what's going on in the world with which it is working and the world that is pressurizing it. And so the events of the southern neighborhood from 2011 onwards had a dramatic effect on Europe. Europe saw itself, and my role within that was to try and support and help the people of the region who were going through the turmoil that was creating all kinds of challenges for them. And to do that by trying to support the aspirations of so many of the young people who were looking for the kind of future that they saw that many in Europe enjoyed. That was about education, it was about work, it was about opportunity, and it was about, in some cases, a feeling that what we offered in our democratic way of life was an area that they would wish to see more obviously in their own countries, whether or not they came from countries where they felt they had freedom, human rights and so on. There was a general sense in many countries that they would like to see that progress much further, much faster. And so the strategy of the European Union was and is to try and help and support people in the region. Within that, there is a great deal of knowledge and understanding that for many people, staying where they were is unacceptable, that it's impossible. And so, just as Jordan has done, one of the big questions has been how to support people who felt that they have to get out. Most people want to stay at home. People don't leave their own nation easily or willingly. They do it often in desperation, either because of a conflict or because of what you might call the politics, or because they don't see economic opportunity. And so the question for Europe is how far do they engage with trying to support countries to be able to offer those opportunities at home? How far can they be involved in helping to resolve conflict so people do not have to leave? But also how far within the way that you look at your economy, there may be opportunities that you can offer people as well. And that is the most difficult and complicated of conversations, as you will imagine, that goes on all the time in Europe, certainly in my time, and I believe will be going on even more so now.
Europe is very important to us and for us. I mean, Europe is our neighbor. And yes, we're following the news in Europe these days with much interest. I mean, in the past, and for the longest possible time, it was our region, the Middle East region, that provided the world with its bad news on a daily basis. I mean,
we're not going to talk about Brexit.
But now we're not alone, and I honestly don't mean that cynically. I mean, we're not alone. There's a lot of news that cause us much concern in many parts of the world. But in the context of the stability and security and economic prosperity of the Middle East, Europe is extremely important to us in Jordan, to the rest of the Middle East. And in previous difficult times, Europe would intervene, not at the expense of someone else, not at the expense of initiatives by the United States, for example, or any other country. Europe played a very important and critical supporting role. At times, Europe would spearhead, and the US would play the supporting role. And there are, I think, many. I mean, one of the initiatives that we established, which is the Union for the Mediterranean, for example, is extremely important. The countries of the Northern Mediterranean, the countries of the Southern Mediterranean, it brought people together. And I'm glad that I remembered that, actually, because it brought 43 countries, brought people together, because the Barcelona process, as you remember, was always disrupted by political developments and political events. So the idea was to create something called the Union for the Mediterranean, where countries can sit together and discuss regional projects that are critical and vital for the livelihood of people, aside from the politics, even if the politics is lagging behind. And by the way, that does not mean that you forget people's legitimate political demands and requests and rights, but it means that you can't just put their livelihood on hold or freeze it until something develops. It's not normalization. It was designed to be, and by the way, a lot of countries really benefited from the initiatives coming out of the Union for the Mediterranean. I mean, look at the details of the UFM, and you'll see what I mean. So Europe is very important for us, and Europe can play a vital role and has played vital roles in the past to promote security and stability in the region. And that, by the way, when I talk about the Middle East, regional security is global security, because what happens in our part of the world affects the rest of the world.
Good morning. My name's Michael Waller. I'm a member of the Wilson Center National Cabinet. I'd like to extend the dialogue we just had with you a little bit broader. In what areas do you think the major external powers, Russia, U.S., China, European Union, should deepen and broaden their engagement in the region? In what areas should they back off? And if your point of view from the government versus the citizenry might answer that question differently, I'd be interested in hearing your views on that as well.
You start.
Me?
You start, I'll follow.
All right. Yeah, no, I don't know what you mean, sir, by the external powers increasing their engagement in the region. I don't know what you mean by engagement. Sometimes engagement is not a good thing. Yeah. Well, look, at the end of the day, like I said, our region is of geostrategic importance for the rest of the world. I mean, we all know that. But it's a two-way street also. I think in this world that we live in today, it's very, very important to have it as a two-way street. We welcome the involvement, I would perhaps say the involvement, not the engagement, of all the countries. I mean, when it came to negotiating the Iran deal, Russia was very much there. Where, you know, the Europeans call it the E3+3, and the rest of the world calls it the 5+1.
Still six.
6 of one and half a dozen of the other. When it comes to Middle East peacemaking, by the way, officially Russia and the United States are still the patrons of the shepherds of the peace process that began in Madrid in 1991, the Madrid process, because what resulted afterwards, Oslo and the different agreements, the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty, etc., were all started at Madrid, and the official two shepherds were, and still are, technically, Russia and the United States. The idea behind the peace process at the time when it began in Madrid was that after bilateral agreements are signed, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine, with Israel, then we go into a multilateral discussion on issues that concern us all, like water, energy, and project developments, infrastructure. The first such conference took place in Moscow, not anywhere else, because Moscow was, you know, definitely very much engaged in that. So China is a huge investor in the region. China's role is perhaps different, but China is a member of the P5, and it's very, very important when we talk about Security Council resolutions relating not just to the Palestinian issue, but also Syria and other conflict zones in our part of the world. I mean, it's very, very important to coordinate. So Europe on the one hand, the United States, Russia, China, all have a positive role to play. So if that was the context of your question, we welcome that. And there are, of course, other arguments when it comes to negative interference, but we don't see much of that. So,
if I can just add to that, I agree with everything Nasser said, but when we were doing the Iran negotiation, one of the things about it was a process of nations plus the EU put together for one purpose. And even though there were many other areas where we were not in agreement, not least what was happening in Ukraine, that kind of group stuck together for that particular purpose. And it's called the P5 because it was the permanent members of the Security Council plus one Germany. We call it E3+3 because it began as 3 European nations to which the US, China and Russia added. So it's still 6, but that's why it appears differently. And it does seem to me that in some of the conflicts or problems, not just in this region but elsewhere, that informal mechanism of bringing people together who also have the capacity through the UN to be strong and dominating forces is an important one that we've sort of lost for the time being because of what's happened, that we need to think about again, because the photograph in 2017 that really struck me was on the Syria conflict, seeing President Putin, President Erdogan and President Rouhani as the people who've yet again met recently who are focused on that. And while I do not dispute that there are many nations who have an interest in the discussion, and if you were putting a informal group together would need to be a presence, there are things that are lacking for me in terms of how other countries, particularly perhaps US and Europe, were not engaging perhaps as effectively as we might. So I also look, when I think about the region, for where are the definable questions or issues that we could resolve, and how would you put together the group that could do that to greatest effect?
Yeah, and I mean, again, if you look at Syria, one thing that one notices immediately is that the 5 or 6 major powers that are shaping what's happening on the ground and possibly the future of Syria are non-Arab and non-Syrian. You have Turkey, Russia, Iran, to a certain extent the United States, and to a certain extent Israel. That also requires coordination and dialogue. And just going back, I mean, when it comes, you said major powers, I would include, for example, Iran. I'd go back to the earlier question that Lady Ashton asked, which is, what do we do about this instability in the region, as we're seeing in the last few weeks in particular? I mean, we have to get to the bottom. I stand by what the Secretary General of the United States, the United Nations said yesterday or today, that we have to be steadfast in being calm and patient and get to the bottom of this. Interrupting 5% of the world's supply of oil is not a joke. Damaging the facility in Aramco and Abqaiq in particular, resulting in almost a 50% reduction in the oil production, is not a joke. And so, we stand by Saudi Arabia in this context, because you can't just target your vitality like that. But we have to get to the bottom of this. We have to know exactly who did it and why. And I think the international community is watching with much concern. And if there is direct or indirect interference, it's simply not acceptable.
I'm going to go over to just to change sides.
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Julian Kyle Lewis from the illustrious Howard University here in Washington. I have a hypothetical question, the same question for each of you. Hypothetically, if you were a citizen in the United States with a family, and you just had to move to anywhere in the Middle East, what model state or area of stability would you choose? Because if you're a middle school or high school student in the United States right now, if you're looking at the news, it just looks like a big blanket of instability and just an entire region. So you can't differentiate from what's the safest from what's the not safest. So hypothetically, where would y'all go? Like,
Jordan.
would you?
Jordan.
Either.
I think that anyone looking at the region who is not necessarily, and why would they be, a scholar or someone who is looking in detail at what's happening, will face not least confusion about what is where and why is this and what has happened here and so on, and a sense that things are not good, to put it at its best. But that's actually to also misunderstand the region, I think, that there are plenty of places where you can go and visit and enjoy, and find that while in the broader region there are issues to be concerned about, there are places that you can visit. But I would always say, Jordan, that's not as flippant as it sounds, because I would.
Can't disagree with that. But two things, if I may, very briefly. Number one, it's very difficult to be objective on this because I am Jordanian, but I agree. But with all due respect, to all the countries of the Middle East. And of course, each country is special in its own way. I think the success story that is Jordan, the openness that you see, the freedom of speech and movement and expression, and we're dealing with a teachers' strike for the last 2 weeks. I mean, unfortunately, the students are the ones who are suffering, and I personally think that they're the biggest victims. But this just shows you when you have these professional unions that are elected directly by their members, and this is what happens. You have to deal with that. So you've got a democratic process, you've got openness, you've got an amazing collection of historic, religious, archaeological sites, 100,000 sites, all in short distances, all within a 3 to 4 hour driving distance. I don't want to act like I'm a minister of tourism, but I'll tell you that the innovation, the skills, the forward-looking, the progressiveness, and like I said, the beauty and the natural beauty of the country is very, very important. Now, it's also very important to remember that the Middle East is very short distances between countries. I mean, this is I'm not including North Africa, but if you talk about the Levant and the Gulf, I mean, they're all within a 2-hour flight of each other. And so we've always suffered from this, particularly in the media coverage. When there's an explosion, that takes place in Yemen, for example, the map that is behind the newscaster includes the entire Middle East, and you see, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. So you get confused, and I don't blame you for thinking that you look at a whole map that shows nothing but instability. But it's very, very important in this day and age with the access to the modern tools of communication, social media, etc. Just to be very careful and to know what you're looking at, rather than falling prey to the subliminal messaging that sometimes comes from certain media outlets.
Next question. I'll take one here.
Diana Negroponte from the Wilson Center. The Gulf Coordinating Council exists. What role might it play, or does it play, in resolving disputes in that map which you have shared with us?
The GCC is a group of countries that got together 40 years ago. It's a regional grouping like the Maghreb Union, for example, like in certain ways the EU when it first started as the EEC and etc. But I mean, what brought them together is, first of all, that they are all countries that are on the Arabian Gulf. They are all oil-based, oil economies or oil-based economies. I mean, if you look at Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, and Kuwait, oil economies. If you look at Oman, which has a little bit of oil, and Bahrain, which has a little bit of oil, but they are both countries that are. And this was, the whole idea was that this council, the Gulf Cooperation Council, was going to develop into, a real union. It's taken some steps forward and some steps back. But certainly, I mean, and they, as you know, have some problems within the council these days. I mean, with the question of Qatar. But I think the GCC has played a very important role in being a united voice sometimes when it came to different conflicts, not just in the region, but elsewhere. But like I said, you've got the Arab League that basically comprises all the Arab countries, all 21, 22 Arab countries, and within that, under that umbrella, you've got the Maghreb Union, you've got GCC, you've got the other regional grouping. So it plays a very important role. I mean, I don't know if it has achieved all the objectives that it set out to be, but there is a plan. I just, on my way out from the hotel this morning, saw the Secretary General of the GCC, a very fine Bahraini gentleman whom I've known for many years. I just literally ran across him this morning. So maybe I should have brought him here to answer that question.
I can't see actually because of the lights. So can the people with the microphones just work out who next?
Jihan Al-Husseini, Washington correspondent in Al-Hayat newspaper, Arabic International. Regarding the Arab-Israeli conflict, what can prevent Israel from achieving its ambition in the light of Arab silence?
I missed the first part.
So can you say it again?
The first part. Yeah.
What can prevent the Israeli to achieving its ambition under the its in the light of Arabic silence? You don't think Arab?
You mean Israel is getting away
yes,
with a lot of what it's getting away with because of Arab silence? That's the question?
Yes. You don't think Arab deserve to blame people in the street? They blame Arab leaders.
For what Israel is doing?
Yes, because there is always Arab in the reaction, only reaction. They don't do anything. In fact, in this,
I don't think I would disagree with that. I don't think that you can apply that.
In reactive position,
Okay.
always.
We've got the. Thank you. We've got the question.
Yeah. No, I wouldn't put that across the board, and I certainly wouldn't generalize. And I think many Arab leaders have taken serious stances when it came to Israeli incursions, and many Arab leaders have taken bold steps towards trying to resolve this conflict. There is an occupation. I think we're all in agreement that this is an illegal occupation, and that the only way to achieve peace and give the Palestinians their dignity and their sovereignty and their statehood is through direct negotiations. And we've seen the parameters. So I mean, what you're saying may be somebody's opinion, and in some cases maybe it's true. Maybe in some cases in the past there was apathy, there was not enough reaction, but I don't think you can apply that across the board.
Oh,
yeah.
I mean, so from the perspective of what's happening in the Middle East, from my viewpoint, Arab leaders have been always engaged in the issues that have been addressed. From part of the reason that I would go to Jordan was also the reason that we would be consulting Arab leaders and talking to the Israelis, of course, as well, about how you would move forward with a solution. I think, though, often young people especially get frustrated about the whole thing. It's not to do with silence or to do with particular leaders. It's simply that they feel an urgency for their lives to improve and for things to be resolved, and that's and perhaps an inevitable part of that. Oh.
Yeah, thank you. It's Dave Rabinowitz, and the Palestinian refugees are primarily refugees from the 1948 war between Israel and the Arab League, a war which I believe has never formally ended. There have been some bilateral peace treaties, but the war itself is ongoing, and it seems like the activities of Hezbollah and Hamas are basically just continuing battles in that war. My questions, number one, is there any prospect for actually having a formal end to the 1948 war? And as a corollary to that, does the Arab League still officially consider all of Israel to be occupied territory? And my second question, specifically about Jordan.
That was two questions, I think.
Yeah.
You can say. So,
all right.
Nice try, but I think we'll just pause for a minute.
So you are right. 1948 war has never officially ended, because the war stopped with an armistice agreement in 1949. It was signed in the island of Rhodes in Greece at the time, 1949. And today, the line that separates the West Bank from Israel is called the Green Line. It's the armistice line. It's not a border yet. Then came the 1967 war, where Israel, and if you know, before 67, the West Bank belonged to Jordan, the Golan Heights belonged to Israel and still do, to Syria and still do, and the Gaza Strip belonged to Egypt. And now it's part of the Palestinian territory. Sorry?
They didn't want it.
Well, that's up to them. So you had the West Bank, part of Jordan, the Golan Heights, part of Syria, Gaza Strip, part of Egypt. When the occupation took place, all right, it was definitely the general consensus that this green line, this armistice line, can only become a permanent border through negotiations once there is a Palestinian state. And by the way, as far as Jordan is concerned, 1988, we took a decision which was called at the time the disengagement, legal and administrative disengagement with the West Bank, meaning that Jordan, well, of course, according to international law, cannot cede territory except to another legal and sovereign nation. But we said, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is the sole representative. This was a decision by the Rabat Summit in 1974, is the legitimate and sole representative of the Palestinian people. The West Bank belonged to Jordan pre-67, but in order to give the Palestinian identity, the prominence and the status that it deserves, we will disengage legal and administrative ties with the West Bank, and of course maintain the presence of the Awqaf in Jerusalem. But that was a decision to support the Palestinians in their future negotiations with Israel. I don't want to get into the lengthy details of the negotiations, but you are right. 1948 would formally end as a conflict once the Palestinian state is established, and once you have clear borders between the Palestinians and the Israelis.
It's the opposite.
It's the opposite? You don't want a Palestinian state?
No, the Palestinian state will be formed once the war ends.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay, we've got time probably only for two more. If we take these two.
I have the microphone.
Who's got the microphone?
Okay, can I ask? Okay, my name is Camilla Bogdan. I'm affiliated
And by the way,
with
the
Woodrow
position of
Wilson.
the Arab League is very clear on supporting the two-state solution. So.
Thank you.
Okay, right, go.
I'm also, I shall ask you a very short question because I'm also judging
I didn't hear what.
Camilla Bogdan. I'm affiliated with the Woodrow Wilson. I'm originally from Romania. So I was wondering, what is your position in the region against these different approaches against terrorism carried out by European Union and the United States? I'm reading, my specialty is tackling money laundering, corruption. I imagine that the rule of law initiative is not that strong in the region if these approaches are needed to put in place. But I'm reading extremely, and I see that banks have to shut down. And I was wondering, are you affected by, and I'm thinking in terms of economic sanctions, about carrying out economic relations with Iran? And what's exactly the issue?
Okay.
Because maybe you have corresponding accounts of in your countries.
We got it. So as I read it, just make sure I've got it. The question is, because of the work that is going on to try and tackle not just terrorism, but the underlying issues around terrorism, the flow of money being one, are countries that are operating in the region affected by those kind of sort of sanctions, sort of things that happen?
Please, I mean, you answered the question better than I did.
Be your region. Do you see that?
Again, what's the question?
So the question would be, I think, am I right? Yes. Okay. I'm only paraphrasing just to save you time. That was all.
Yeah.
No, it's fine. It's quicker if I paraphrase.
Yeah.
If you have sanctions operating in order to counter terrorism and the underlying issues, e.g. the flow of money.
You're not just targeting governments, you're targeting people.
Right. Does that affect, is Jordan affected by that, or do you see the region affected by that?
No, Jordan is not affected by that. Jordan is affected by the general atmosphere. And Jordan, like you all know, is way out there in front of everybody when it comes to fighting extremism and terrorism, and especially people who perpetrate these heinous acts in the name of religion, any religion. Most of the victims of terrorism around the world are Muslims, by the way. Even though some of these terrorists who carry out these attacks claim that they are doing it in the name of Islam, which is absolute rubbish, because Islam is a religion of peace and tolerance and acceptance and openness, and it does not call for the violence and the terror that these people commit. So if there are sanctions against an entire region, I'm not sure that there are. Would you correct me on that? Is there a set of sanctions against an entire region?
No.
No. So,
I
Well,
I think sanctions are either targeting specific countries or specific entities within countries.
I think that's as far as we can give you an
Yep.
answer, to be honest. I hope that's okay. So, okay, so we're going to start winding up. We've got two here, so perhaps we could take, and then, but can you ask your questions one after the other, the three of you, and then we'll answer it as one? Is that okay?
Sure.
Thank you.
Benjamin Tour, retired American diplomat. Governments about everywhere in the U.S., in Europe, important Israeli security officials, and just about everybody seems to think that the continuation of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is not good for the region and for their own particular interests. Given that, governments still don't seem to be doing much to apply pressure on Israel, which is by far the stronger party in this conflict. Civil society has taken up the gap to some extent through efforts such as the boycott, divestment, and sanctions interest movement. Could you please speak to the effect of movements such as this in Jordan and also in Europe, which is somewhat more advanced than the United States is on this issue, although there has been a recent shift in the U.S. in discussion of sanctions? Thank you.
Okay, we're going to take all three, and then our next question, and then one over here, and then we'll answer it.
My name is Tagreed Rishek. I'm the Washington correspondent for Al Ghad newspaper in Jordan. I want to ask His Excellency Nasser Judeh, don't you think that Israel should be concerned about the peace treaty with Jordan, with all the provocative statements and actions taken by the Israeli government? The Speaker of the House, the Jordanian Speaker of the House lately said something about that peace treaty could be threatened by these statements and actions, but we never heard anything like that on the government level in Jordan. Do you think it could reach something like that at the end?
Thank you. And the last one here.
Marta Verbetic, I'm from Wilson Center. I would try to be short because there's not much time. If you could speak a little bit more about refugee problems, I think it's really a long-term problem, and I know that Jordan is the home of many Palestinian refugees. How do you see this problem of the right of the return? And very directly, are Palestinians still interested in two-state solutions or one-state solution? And
okay, stop. Otherwise I won't be able to remember them. That's all. So we have the question of the boycott specifically, but within the generality of pressure. The question of whether Israel should be worried about the peace treaty with Jordan and the implications from statements that have been made, and refugees in general, but specifically, are the Palestinians still interested and believing in the two-state solution?
Right. Number one, in terms of pressure, I'll say two things. I mean, I'll answer your question perhaps in a not in a roundabout, but in an indirect way. One of the key elements that kept the peace process alive. And by the way, we always used to joke that there was too much process and not enough peace. Very, very little progress was made in different initiatives, but there was some progress made. But one of the key elements in maintaining or keeping the peace process alive was international support for this process and positive pressure on everybody to keep engaged in direct negotiations. Our biggest fear in our part of the world, and by the way, there are many other problems now, but we keep saying in Jordan that the Palestinian-Israeli, the wider Arab-Israeli conflict remains the root cause of much of the instability that we see, not just in the region, but elsewhere. But a key factor in keeping that alive is international attention and positive pressure. We've seen times where international attention was diverted elsewhere, and that always resulted in a a slowing down of the Middle East peace process, and that is always of serious concern to us. The United States, the general impression in our part of the world is that the United States has a historic bias towards Israel. But the United States was always an honest broker when it came to a serious crunch. I mean, when there was a serious, flagrant disregard to the elements of the peace process by Israel, the United States would step in and apply pressure even on Israel. We've seen that. If you remember back during Bush 41, when there was really an expansion of settlement activity, which is contrary to the official position of the United States. He withheld the housing loan guarantees, $10 billion at the time. And there are many such instances. So there's pressure that is applied sometimes by the United States, there's pressure that is applied by Europe, there's pressure that is applied by the Arab countries, and that's always important. But international attention to the peace process is critical and is key to maintaining at least some hope that this peace process is still alive somewhere, ailing and struggling, but alive and can be revived at some stage. So
we're not going to do this. We're not going to do a dialogue because we've got two other questions. So we hasn't finished. He just took breath. He just took breath. I can't hold.
All right.
Give him a chance.
Yeah. The boycott thing was part of your statement, sir. And like I said, Europe took a decision when it came to the products that are made in the settlements, and so I mean, right now let's look at the larger picture. Let's not look at the minor details. It's important to apply pressure in different ways, but let's look at the larger picture. Taghreed, I'm not in any official capacity here, but I will tell you something. Egypt and Israel went to arbitration over Taba after they signed the peace treaty. And Egypt won and got Taba back because Israel insisted at the time that Taba belonged to it. The peace treaty is not just about compromise. The peace treaty is a tool that you can use effectively to state your case and to lodge your complaints and to have serious differences. Signing a peace treaty does not mean you have to accept everything that the other party does hands down. You've seen in the context of the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty that we've used the peace treaty to support the Palestinians. In particular, when there were no channels of communication with Israel, when there were serious incidents where Palestinians were being arrested and harassed and in some cases brutally murdered, it was the Palestinians who would come and say, Jordan, please, use your tools of communication, use your channels of communication, use the legal grounds of the peace treaty in order to put our case across, because we don't have that capability. So what I wanted to say is that the peace treaty has a legal, political background and process in Jordan, and I'm not in a position to comment on that. But don't look at the peace treaty as something that weakens Jordan's position. On the contrary, it makes it stronger. You can use the peace treaty and all the. I mean, look. Recently, for example, we decided that one of the annexes of the peace treaty is not going to be renewed. The two annexes regarding Baqura in the north and Ghamar in the south. When we signed the peace treaty in 1994, the two annexes were 25 years old. Each party had 1 year to inform the other. We did last year. We informed the Israelis that we're not renewing this arrangement for the farms in the north and the farms in the south. It took a sovereign decision to do that. We used the peace treaty on several occasions. All the diplomatic, legal clauses in the peace treaty when it came to the holy sites and protecting the holy sites. So look at the larger picture again. From my vantage point, I mean, we use the peace treaty to put our case in a stronger way. We use the legal tools that we have in the peace treaty. Now, like I said, there's a process. Jordan is a country of institutions and the parliament and the government, and at the end of the day, we look at the strategic interest of Jordan, but we look at what makes Jordan's position stronger, not weaker. Refugees. You in Jordan, by the way, you're talking about, like I said, 42% of the Palestinian refugees everywhere are in Jordan. Do they still believe in the right of return? I mean, I can't really answer on them, but it is a right. The right of return and compensation is a right. By the way, I mean, if you look at the negotiations that took place between the late Chairman Arafat and the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, in 2000, they addressed one big taboo up until then, which was Jerusalem. 2008, President Abbas and the then Prime Minister of Israel, Olmert, delved into another taboo, which is refugees. And they actually had a serious discussion on this question of the right of return and the right of compensation. So I think who wants to exercise that right and in what context you have to ask them. I can't answer, but it is a right, and we defend that right in Jordan with everything that we have. This is United Nations Resolution 194. It's very, very clear. The right of return and compensation. The problem is that UNRWA, which was created in 1951 to deal specifically with the question of Palestinian refugees. Imagine, there's UNHCR that deals with all the refugees in the world, and there's UNRWA that was specifically designed to deal with the Palestinian refugees. And we, of course, are extremely concerned about the lack of sufficient funding for UNRWA to complain. Why? For different reasons. A, because of the fact that the Palestinian issue has not been resolved yet, and when it is resolved, Palestinian UNRWA can be dissolved. That's it. Its mandate will be finished. When you have a Palestinian state, when you have independence, when you have sovereignty, when you have compensation, when you have whatever. But more importantly, UNRWA, in the 5 areas that it operates in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, West Bank, and Gaza, runs schools that have 500,000 students. You dry up the funding for UNRWA and you're sending 500,000 kids to the streets as a present to extremists. You know, here you are, come and get them. So just look at that, remember that, and the world international community has to remember that. That's why in Jordan we say, by the way, 125, under 30,000 of these students are in Jordanian school in Jordan. So when a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, when UNRWA was 90 million short, and the schools in Jordan were not going to be able to begin the academic year, we were out there helping, and last year as well. We were out there helping at the level of His Majesty, the government, the ministers, everybody helping to get the funds for UNRWA, because leaving kids without education is a very dangerous thing.
Nasser, thank you. Thank you to all of you, first of all, for coming and for the questions. It's really interesting when you talk about this region, where your focal points are, and perhaps not surprisingly today, the Middle East peace process is still very much in the minds of many people here who are looking at this question, the core, if you like, of the issues that exist in the region, and one, as you described it, Nasser, that needs to be resolved in order to aid and assist everything else to be resolved. And that, I think, is very important. And the consequences of conflict and pain for people are the number of refugees, more in the world than there were at the end of the Second World War, which is a point when the world saw enormous chaos, as we see now. And refugees who are searching for a better place to live, a temporary refuge, looking for things, especially for their children and their families, and the international community trying to find the right kind of responses in difficult and challenging circumstances, for sure. And back to this whole question of, what do we do? What does the international community? What is Europe's response? How is Europe shaped by this part of its neighbourhood? And how far does Europe need to step up, need to develop and design new initiatives and new ways of addressing old problems and new ones? And I think what I always take away is that there are some things that we know We know that there needs to be a two-state solution. We want Israel to be a successful, prosperous nation. We want the Palestinians to be able to have their own nation too. We want the region to take the opportunities that that might afford to be able to develop together and be stronger as a region, and to use the international community more to try and tackle some of the inherent problems that we see currently existing, whether that's in Yemen, whether that's the tension with Iran and what's happening there, or whether again that is old problems and ongoing horrific conflicts like in Syria that need to be dealt with. You will know from this conversation why I would always begin my journeys to the Middle East by going to see him. Arriving in Jordan, which is beautiful if you've not been, and I strongly recommend a visit there. But going to Jordan, you would meet all kinds of people fully engaged in the region and in looking at what might be done, and no people more so than His Majesty King Abdullah and of course his then Foreign Minister and close ally, Nasser Judeh. So thank you, Nasser, for coming to Wilson. It's been wonderful to have you. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you very
Great
much.
questions, some difficult, but great questions. So thank you, and I look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you very much, Cathy. You're very kind. Thank you for the invitation, really.